He stood there in the golden wash of a Tuesday afternoon sun, a sleeping 7-year-old slumped against his shoulder, her small arms looped around his neck, her sneakers scuffed and one shoelace long gone, and he watched his own reflection in the polished glass of a building he had built from nothing, watched a security guard on the other side raise a hand, palm out, and shake his head. Not today. Not for you. That was the moment Julian Voss understood all over again exactly what it felt like to be nobody. If you believe kindness deserves a second chance, and you believe the people who show it deserve to be seen, hit that like button right now, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, share this with someone who needs a reminder that decency still matters, and subscribe to Karma Chronicles, because stories like this one are the reason we started this channel. To understand why a man was turned away from the lobby of his own 5-star hotel, you first have to understand who Julian Voss used to be, long before the marble floors and the crystal chandeliers and the names stitched in gold thread onto hotel bathrobes in 11 countries. He was born in the back room of a laundromat in a city that never once felt warm to him, raised by a mother who cleaned other people's houses during the day and cried quietly into a dish towel most nights, thinking her son was asleep. He remembered, with a clarity that never dulled no matter how many years passed, the winter he was 9 years old, when his mother took him into a restaurant on Christmas Eve because she had saved for months to give him one warm meal that didn't come from a can. He remembered the way the host looked at their coats, thin, patched at the elbows, and told them, without a flicker of shame, that the restaurant was at capacity, even though Julian could see, over the man's shoulder, at least 6 empty tables dressed in white linen. He remembered his mother's hand trembling in his as she said, "Thank you anyway," and led him back out into the cold, and told him, with a smile that cost her everything she had left that night, that they would find somewhere better. He never forgot that word, better. He spent the rest of his life chasing it, not for the marble and the chandeliers, but for the promise underneath them, that no child would ever again stand outside a warm room and be told in so many careful, polite words that he did not belong. By the time he was 41, Julian Voss owned 43 hotels across 3 continents, and the flagship of them all, the Meridian Grand, rose 31 stories above the heart of the city like a monument to everything he had built out of a laundromat and a mother's tired hands. He had married a woman named Elena, who used to tease him for still checking under hotel beds for dust because he could never quite let go of the fear that someone, somewhere, might feel unwelcome under his roof. Elena had died 2 years earlier, on a rain-slick highway on her way to pick up their daughter Wren from a birthday party, and since then Julian had done the only thing that made the grief bearable. He threw himself into the company, into the promise he had made as a 9-year-old boy standing outside a restaurant, into raising Wren the way Elena would have wanted, with warmth instead of wealth as the first language of their home. He had one habit that his board of directors found eccentric, and his employees, when they didn't know who he was, found nothing at all. He traveled to his own hotels unannounced. No entourage, no reservation under his real name, no warning to the staff. He wore ordinary clothes and carried a duffel bag instead of the leather luggage the brand sold in its gift shops, because he wanted to see, with his own eyes and no filter of deference, how his hotels treated the people who walked in off the street with nothing but hope that they'd be treated like they mattered. It was the only way he knew to keep the promise alive. That Tuesday, he had flown in with Wren after a long-delayed connection from a hotel opening 3 time zones away, both of them rumpled and hollow-eyed, her hair escaping its braid in soft, dark wisps, a stuffed rabbit missing one button eye clutched under her arm. His phone had died somewhere over the ocean. His card for the reservation was under a shell company name, as always, tucked into a wallet that looked, admittedly, like it had seen better decades. He had not slept in almost a day. He wanted, more than anything else in the world in that moment, a bed for his daughter and a few hours where he did not have to be Julian Voss, CEO, just a father, getting his kid to sleep. The young man at the front desk, a sharp-suited assistant manager named Grant Ashford, whose nameplate gleamed under the lobby's warm lighting, did not see any of that. He saw a man in a wrinkled t-shirt with a sleeping child on his shoulder and a duffel bag with a broken zipper, and he made a decision about who that man was before Julian had finished a single sentence. "I'm sorry, sir. We're fully booked," Grant said. Not sorry at all, his eyes already sliding past Julian toward the next guest in line, a woman in a tailored blazer wheeling a monogrammed suitcase. Perhaps try somewhere more in your price range down the block. Julian, exhausted and gentle-voiced so as not to wake Wren, explained that he had a reservation, that the booking should be under a company account, that if Grant could just check the system. "Sir, I've checked. There's nothing here." Grant's voice had dropped, the way people's voices do when they've already decided a conversation is beneath them. "I really can't keep holding up the line for this." It was such a small thing in the grand architecture of a life. A denied room, a dismissive tone. But Julian felt something crack open in his chest that had nothing to do with the hotel, and everything to do with a 9-year-old boy standing in the cold outside a restaurant, watching his mother pretend it didn't hurt. Wren stirred against his shoulder, blinking awake, and looked first at her father's face, and then at the man behind the desk, and in the particular unbearable way that children absorb shame before they even understand its shape, she went quiet and pressed her face back into his neck, as if trying to disappear. That was the part Julian could not forgive. Not the insult to himself. He had weathered worse in boardrooms and back alleys on his way up. It was the way his daughter had felt it too, had understood without being told that they were being looked at and found wanting, and had tried to make herself smaller because of it. He asked quietly to speak to the general manager. Grant, visibly irritated now, told him the general manager was unavailable, and that if he didn't move along, security would need to assist him in relocating. 2 guests in line behind him were now watching, whispering, and Julian felt the particular singular humiliation of being discussed as though he could not hear it, as though he were a problem to be managed rather than a person standing right there. It was in that moment, in the exact geometry of that humiliation, that someone finally saw him. Her name was Soraya Bennett, and she was 23 years old, working the valet stand just inside the lobby doors, 6 months into her first job out of hospitality school, and already exhausted by how little the word hospitality seemed to matter to some of her co-workers. She had watched the whole exchange from her post, her jaw tightening with each dismissive word from Grant. And when she saw the little girl press her face into her father's shoulder, something in Soraya simply would not let her stand still any longer. She crossed the lobby without asking anyone's permission, pulled a bottle of water from behind her station, and knelt slightly so she was closer to Wren's eye level. "Hey, sweetheart," she said softly. "That's a really brave bunny you've got there. Does he have a name?" Wren, startled by the gentleness of it, peeked out and, after a moment, whispered, "Mr. Buttons. He only has one eye now." Soraya nodded solemnly, as if this were the most important information she'd received all day, and said, "Well, Mr. Buttons looks like he could use a rest. Why don't you two sit right over here while your dad sorts things out? I'll bring you some crackers, too, if that's all right." Grant, watching this from the desk, snapped at her to get back to the valet stand, that she wasn't paid to babysit walk-ins, that this wasn't her department. Soraya's face flushed, but she didn't back down entirely. She got Wren settled into a lobby armchair, murmured that she'd be right back, and only then returned to her post, glancing over her shoulder the whole way with a worry that had nothing to do with her job description and everything to do with simple human decency. Julian did not miss a single second of it. He asked Grant, one more time calmly, to check under a different name, his own, and to look at the reservation more carefully. Grant, now thoroughly annoyed and eager to end what he clearly saw as an unwinnable argument with an insistent, disheveled stranger, said the words that would end his career within the hour. "Sir, I don't know what you're trying to pull, but this is a 5-star property. We have a certain standard of guest here, and frankly, you and your daughter don't exactly fit it. I'd appreciate you not making a scene in front of our other guests." The lobby for a moment went very quiet. Julian set his duffel bag down. He did not raise his voice. Those who worked closely with him would later say that was always the most dangerous version of Julian Voss, the perfectly calm one. And he asked Grant a single question. Did he know whose name was on the deed to the building he was currently standing in? Grant laughed, a short, disbelieving sound, and said something about how he was sure Julian was very important somewhere. It was the general manager, hurrying out from the back office, having finally been alerted to the commotion by a nervous junior staffer, who recognized him first. Recognized the founder of the entire hospitality group from a framed photograph that hung, ironically, less than 30 feet away in the executive hallway, the one from the ribbon-cutting ceremony 8 years earlier. Julian Voss shaking hands with the mayor, Elena at his side, both of them younger and unguarded and so proud of what they'd built. The general manager, a man named Preston Hale who had held his position for 6 years and had grown comfortable enough in it to stop asking hard questions about how his staff actually treated people, went the color of old paper. Mr. Voss, Preston stammered. I had no idea, sir. I am so deeply sorry. There's clearly been some terrible misunderstanding. There's been no misunderstanding at all, Julian said quietly, and something in his voice made even the whispering guests in line go still. I asked for a room. I was denied one and insulted in front of my daughter because a man behind that desk decided, on sight, that we didn't belong here. That's not a misunderstanding, Preston. That's exactly what it looks like. He asked to see the lobby's security footage, not just from that afternoon, but from the past several weeks. Preston, pale and sweating now, escorted him to the back office, past a stunned Grant who had finally, belatedly, understood the scale of what he'd just done, and past Soraya, who watched the little procession go by with wide eyes, not yet understanding that the exhausted stranger she'd knelt down to comfort was the man whose name was on her paycheck. But the footage showed, over the following 2 hours, broke something in Julian that had been quietly cracking for longer than he'd realized. It showed an elderly man in a threadbare coat, clearly a veteran by his cap and pins, turned away from the lounge 2 weeks earlier because staff assumed he couldn't afford the minimum spend. It showed a mother with 3 children denied a seat in the restaurant during a slow Tuesday lunch because a host decided wordlessly that the family wasn't a good fit for the dining room's atmosphere. It showed, again and again, in small gestures and dismissive tones and doors quietly not held open, a pattern that Julian recognized instantly because he had lived on the other side of it as a 9-year-old boy in a thin coat. Somewhere along the way, in the pursuit of chandeliers and Michelin stars and 5-star ratings, the culture of the flagship hotel bearing his name had rotted from the inside, and no one above the front desk had cared enough to notice because it had never happened to them. And then the footage showed something else. It showed Soraya Bennett, on 4 separate occasions over the past 2 months, doing small, unremarkable, extraordinary things that nobody had asked her to do and nobody had thanked her for. Carrying an umbrella out to a rideshare driver caught in the rain. Sitting with a frightened elderly guest whose family hadn't arrived yet, holding her hand until they did. Quietly slipping a to-go meal to a delivery worker waiting outside in the cold, off her own employee discount, because she'd noticed he'd been standing there for 20 minutes with nowhere to sit. And, that very afternoon, kneeling down to a crying child's eye level while the men around her decided whether her father deserved a room. Julian watched all of it in silence, Wren asleep again in his lap, Mr. Buttons tucked under her chin, and when the footage ended, he did not shout. He did not throw furniture or fire people on the spot in a blaze of theatrical fury, the way people might imagine a wronged billionaire would. He simply sat very still for a long moment, and then he said, in a voice that Preston Hale would later describe as the most frightening thing he'd ever heard precisely because it wasn't angry at all, that he wanted a full staff meeting called for the following morning. Every employee on shift that day. No exceptions. That night, for the first time in longer than he could remember, Julian did not go to his corporate suite across town. He booked a room himself, under his real name this time, in the very hotel that had turned him away, and he lay awake long after Wren had finally drifted into an exhausted, peaceful sleep beside him, thinking not about revenge, but about his mother's hand trembling in the cold outside a restaurant 20 years ago, and about how easy it apparently was, even for a company built on the memory of that exact pain, to forget the lesson the moment the marble got polished enough. The next morning, a bright, ordinary Wednesday, sunlight pouring gold across the lobby's marble floor the way it did every day, indifferent to what was about to happen beneath it, every staff member on the flagship's front-of-house team gathered in the grand ballroom before their shifts began. Grant Ashford stood near the back, his face gray, having spent the night composing and deleting a dozen different apology texts he never had the courage to send. Preston Hale stood near the front, clutching a folder of resignation paperwork he had prepared for himself before Julian had even asked for it. Julian did not do what everyone in that room expected. He did not read out a list of names for public humiliation. He stood at the front of the ballroom in the same plain clothes he'd worn the day before, Wren sitting quietly in a chair beside the podium, coloring in a notebook, utterly unbothered by the weight of the room around her, and he told them a story. He told them about a laundromat, and a mother's tired hands, and a Christmas Eve when he was 9 years old, and learned exactly how it feels to be looked at and found lacking by people who had never once had to wonder if they belonged somewhere. He told them that he had built this company, brick by brick and hotel by hotel, on a single promise: that dignity would never again be something a person had to earn by looking wealthy enough, or well-dressed enough, or important enough. And he told them that yesterday, in his own flagship hotel, under his own name on the deed, that promise had been broken, not by one bad employee, but by a culture that had quietly, gradually, stopped asking whether it was being kept at all. He did fire people that morning, Grant Ashford among them, along with 3 others whose patterns on the footage had been too consistent, too deliberate to be dismissed as bad days. He accepted Preston Hale's resignation, not out of cruelty, but because Preston himself understood, with the particular clarity of a man who has just seen his own negligence laid bare, that he could not credibly lead a culture he had allowed to fail. But Julian was careful, in a way that surprised the room, to make it clear that this was not a purge born of anger. He offered every departing employee severance, a genuine recommendation for roles elsewhere, and, for those who wanted it, a conversation about what had gone wrong, because he had not built an empire by believing people were beyond understanding why they'd failed. And then he asked Soraya Bennett to come to the front of the room. She walked up on legs that felt unsteady, certain she was about to be fired too, certain that stepping outside her department the day before had finally caught up with her. And she was so startled by what Julian actually said that she would later admit she'd barely been able to process it in the moment. He told the room what the footage had shown: the umbrella, the meal for the delivery driver, the hand held for a frightened stranger, the crackers, and the kindness for a little girl with a one-eyed rabbit while everyone else in that lobby had been too busy deciding who deserved to be there. He told them that this, not the marble, not the chandeliers, not the 5-star rating, was what the Meridian Grand was supposed to be. And then he offered Soraya, on the spot, the newly created position of Director of Guest Experience for the entire flagship property, a role with real authority to shape how every single employee, from the valet stand to the executive suite, treated the people who walked through those doors. Soraya cried. So did several other people in that ballroom, including, quietly at the back, a man named Grant Ashford, who understood in that moment exactly what he had thrown away, and exactly why. In the months that followed, the Meridian Grand did not become a softer, weaker version of itself. It became something rarer. Julian launched a company-wide training initiative across all 43 properties, one he named Elena's Promise, after his late wife, built on a single simple principle that new hires learned before they learned anything about wine pairings or thread counts: that every person who walked through the door, in a torn coat or a tailored suit, with a briefcase or a one-eyed stuffed rabbit, was to be treated as though they mattered, because they did. He installed a direct, anonymous reporting line for guests and staff alike to flag moments when that promise was broken, and he read every single report himself, every week, without fail. Word of what had happened spread, quietly at first and then not quietly at all. A story shared by a stunned staff member, then picked up by a local paper, then by people online who had their own memories of being looked at and found wanting somewhere they'd hoped to feel welcome. The elderly veteran who'd been turned away from the lounge received a personal call from Julian himself, and an invitation to return as a guest of honor. The mother of 3 who'd been denied a table found, the next time she visited, a handwritten note waiting in her room, apologizing, and a standing invitation to bring her children back any time, no reservation required. Bookings at the Meridian Grand did not fall after the story broke, the way some on Julian's board had nervously predicted. They rose, steadily, filled by people who wanted more than marble floors, to stay somewhere that had proven, publicly, painfully, honestly, that it was willing to look itself in the mirror. A bright afternoon nearly a year later, Julian stood once again in the lobby of the Meridian Grand, sunlight spilling gold across the floor exactly as it had the day everything changed, and watched Soraya Bennett, now unmistakably, comfortably in charge, crouch down to greet a family checking in, a mother in a threadbare coat with 2 tired children in tow, luggage held together with tape instead of buckles. He watched Soraya smile at them, the exact same way she had smiled at Wren almost a year before, without a flicker of judgment, without a single second of hesitation, and he watched the mother's shoulders visibly relax, the way his own mother's never had. all those years ago outside a restaurant in the cold. Ren, 8 years old now, tugged at his sleeve and asked if that family could have the room with the good view, the one on the 9th floor that faced the park, because it had made her feel better the night they'd stayed there. Julian looked down at his daughter, then back at the lobby, at the family being welcomed with warmth instead of measured out with suspicion. And he felt for the first time in longer than he could name that the promise he'd made as a 9-year-old boy had finally, truly been kept. Not because of anything written in a company handbook, but because kindness, once it's given a real chance, has a way of teaching everyone around it how to be a little braver, a little softer, a little more willing to see the person standing right in front of them. If this story moved something in you, if it reminded you that a single act of kindness can change the whole direction of someone's life, please don't scroll past without letting us know. Like this video, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to Karma Chronicles if you believe, like we do, that the world still has room for second chances. Before you go, we have one small, honest request. Type the word kindness in the comments below if this story touched your heart even a little. We read every single one, and it means more than you know to see how many people still believe in showing up for each other. Julian never forgot the cold outside that restaurant when he was 9 years old, but he lived long enough to make sure that no one who walked through his doors would ever have to feel it again. And somewhere in that quiet, golden lobby, with his daughter's hand in his and a promise, finally, fully kept, that was worth more to him than every marble floor and chandelier he'd ever built.